I'm gonna pick on you for a minute. Doesn't mean that I don't like you, doesn't mean that I don't like where you live, but I have to pick on you because there was a pretty big study that took a look at over 18,000 people. They gave me a lot of data. So I hate having to do this, but I gotta pick this region apart. Okay, so the Journal of Nutritional Sciences had published a paper, again, took a look at 18,080 people, a big analysis, and it was looking at different regions in terms of diet and what people generally ate, to try to determine which region had the worst diet when it came down to cognitive function. Now, if we understand how cognitive function plays a role, not just with cognitively how we feel, but just that central feeling of how our bodies feel too, then yeah, it might make sense that the diet that is probably the worst for the body is also probably the worst for the brain. But anyhow, unfortunately, it's the Southern diet. Now, when this Journal of Nutritional Science study broke this down, it was mainly looking at it because there was a lot of sugar, there was a lot of vegetable oils, a lot of like canola, a lot of soybean oil, a lot of saturated fat, a lot of fried foods, but most of all, a lot of hyperpalatable processed food. Now, I'm going to talk about what the study illuminated first, and then I'll kind of give my insights into it, because I do think that a Southern diet can be manipulated to not be so bad by simply changing a few things. So this video isn't just to pick on you. This video is to say, okay, here's what is seen as a cognitively terrible diet. What can we change within it? So they found that there was lower verbal memory and lower executive function within the Southern diet. Okay, well, those are both two very important things. Okay, so executive function is like the prefrontal cortex, like frontal lobe, like override for everything. Okay, so if that executive function is lower, then a lot of other functions can be lower too, our ability to logically think through things. But what we have to do is we can't just take a large observational study like this and understand mechanisms. So with that, we turn to the rats. So now you probably understand how science kind of works a little bit. Like we see big things, and then we start looking at mechanisms in vitro, in petri dishes, and then we look in rats. There was a study done in rats that was published in the journal Hippocampus that looked at these kinds of foods, these processed foods, these saturated fats, these fried foods, characteristically a Southern style diet. And they put these rats for 8 months on this diet. Okay, and they found fairly obviously that there was a decrease in dendritic spine density. There was also a reduction in spatial learning and a reduction in long-term potentiation, as well as a reduction in BDNF. All of that is gobbledygook. What that simply means is that there was less overall function of the brain cells. Basically, the neurons were not able to effectively send their signals as well. So when we talk about a decrease in spatial learning, that is a decrease in the brain being able to create sort of a mental image of the environment that you're in. So with rats, they were using a maze. These rats could not navigate the maze as well when they were eating 8 months of a Southern style diet or heavily processed diet that is characteristic of a Southern diet. So we have these series of neurons, a series of cells that communicate with one another, okay? Now when we have a decrease in what is called dendritic spine density, essentially what's happening is you're having less branches, if you want to call it that reach out and collect signals from other neurons. So the neurons, our brain is a bunch of neurons sending signals down axons that communicate with dendrites. So basically it's a bunch of branches that send electrical signals, okay? Well, if these electrical signals can't get to their destination, then brain function is going to go down, right? So in this particular case, when there was less spine density or dendritic density, that means there were less branches able to receive a signal, which explains why executive function might go down in some other studies, because it's all kind of connected there. Now, when we look at long-term potentiation, that's interesting because long-term potentiation is like the solidifying of those pathways. So when you have this, these cells that are sending signals and they're transmitting to one another, and they do that over a long period of time, they create a very clear pathway between one another. It's called long-term potentiation. It's our synapses going to the gym and getting stronger. It's reinforcing a bridge, reinforcing that communication. Well, if long-term potentiation went down, that means that neuroplasticity, the ability to adapt and everything like that, went down. Okay, so pretty serious things, but also a decrease in BDNF. Now, BDNF in the positive way has been associated with so many positive things, right? In terms of potential growth of new neurons, potential communication being increased within the brain. Lots of good things. So a decrease in BDNF is obviously a step in the wrong direction. Now, okay, well, I could pick apart this diet more and go into kind of the waistline studies and all of this and that, but I don't need to beat it into the ground too much more. Let's talk about what we can change. Okay, from a hyperpalatability standpoint, this is something that's very important. Things that are fatty and things that are sweet are going to satisfy our brain in different ways, period. Okay. When we have these big surges in dopamine, we can effectively burn out our dopamine receptors. I don't want to say literal burnout, but you can really desensitize them, which means that you need more and more and more of something to do the same job. So something that's hyperpalatable, of course, is going to increase cravings, not just from a blood sugar response, but as far as our dopamine response is concerned too. So when you have hyper sweet, like soda, things like that, along with hyper fatty, saturated fat, fried stuff, then you run into a problem. Those hyperpalatable things are things that we need to be paying attention to. A lot of this can simply be solved by prioritizing protein first. So hyperpalatability, above all, protein first. That just solves that problem. Why? Because not only does protein satiate you, not only does protein help you in that category, but protein also attenuates the blood glucose response. Okay, 2 times more than that of fat. Okay, so protein before your carbohydrates is pivotal. It's so critical to be able to attenuate that blood sugar response and maybe make it so you're not craving a bunch of other hyperpalatable stuff. I put a link down below if you want to check out Thrive Market. There is a 25% off discount link. They're an online grocery store. So if you're trying to overhaul your diet, it is a tremendous place to start. Okay, seriously, like everything on their digital shelves, so to speak, is going to be something that is a better for you option. Okay, I've even assisted in what kind of products are there. Okay, so really taking a good hard look at what foods are potentially better for you, putting them on a better grocery store online, and then being able to have them delivered to your doorstep. So you go on Thrive Market, you select the different diet type that you're doing. Maybe you're paleo, maybe you're no sugar, maybe you're gluten-free. You can sort by different subtype, and from there, then you do your shopping, gets delivered to your doorstep. So the link down below is a special link that saves you 25% off your entire first order, plus you get a free gift. So the foods that are on Thrive Market have Thomas DeLauer's stamp of approval. That's the whole idea, trying to change the world this way. It's really cool. So that link is down below. Get your groceries to your doorstep. Okay, now let's talk about fried foods for just a second. Where fried foods become a problem isn't so much the act of actually frying the food. It's 2 parts, okay? You have a higher glycemic refined flour, okay, which is already going to be a problem. There's already quite a bit of evidence showing that that's going to be hyperpalatable and not exactly good as far as insulin, as far as glucose, anyway, we just want to avoid that. I'm not going to get into the gluten discussion, but that is something that's high glycemic that we probably should be careful of, and it's just processed, right? Then what happens is you have a spike in insulin that happens from that, and you're putting this into a bunch of cruddy oil. So you're having a simultaneous ingestion of a high fat and high carbohydrates, refined and probably low quality oil. Okay, so the first thing that you do with that is if you can make simple changes by swapping out the kind of flours that you would bread things with to things like maybe hazelnut flour, maybe almond flour, maybe even blanched almond meal, things like that, you're going to be in a much better situation. Another thing that you can use is cassava or tiger nut flour or arrowroot flour. They are what are called resistant starches. So they break down differently in the gut. Okay. Just like the name implies, they're resistant. So what that means is that since they're resistant, they don't absorb the same way that regular flour does, but they still fry up like flour. I actually have made like paleo-style chicken breast and paleo-style fish tacos with cassava and arrowroot and tapioca starch. So really cool stuff to use there if you're going to be frying. Now, the oils that you want to fry in, this is where we run into another problem, okay? There's some preliminary evidence that's been done in mice that was taking a look at hypothalamic gene expression, and it did demonstrate that the soybean oils and the canola oils could be playing a role in neuroinflammation. Again, it's done in rodent models, but we do know overall that if you have a lot of omega-6 fats from low-quality oils like soybean oil and from canola oil, and you don't have a lot of omega-3s to balance it out, that could be an inflammatory situation. Omega-6s and omega-3s work in tandem together. We don't want to have tremendous amounts of omega-6s because then you don't have enough omega-3s to balance it out. Omega-6s can still drive inflammation, but yes, but maybe not as much as people tend to tout. The bottom line is that when you're eating a 20 or 30-to-1 ratio of omega-6s to omega-3s, that's when you have a problem, okay? So these things that are called pro-inflammatory mediators are very important to pay attention to. So it's not a very difficult switch to be able to say, I'm gonna ditch the soybean oil, and if I fry some food at home, I'm going to fry in avocado oil, which has a high heat, right? Or high heat tolerance. It can deal with high heat before it reaches its smoke point. So you can fry in things like avocado oil. Now, another thing that you want to look at is possibly suet. Okay, suet is a form of lard that is predominantly stearic acid. I don't want to get into the super nitty-gritty, but stearic acid is a saturated fat that has been correlated with much better biomarkers than, say, palmitic or even myristic, other kinds of saturated fats. So you don't want to be using the shortening, you don't want to be using the margarine, you don't want to be using the canolas, soybean oil. Go for the avocado oil, go for the oils like and the fats like the suet, occasionally even tallow, better quality that even if they're saturated fat, have a better profile of suet and stearic acid, which is just overall better fat. And then with the sweeteners, this is a pretty basic one. The funny thing is there was a study that was published in the British Journal of Nutrition, I'll just paraphrase it here, took a look at over 800 people that were type 2 diabetics, and it did demonstrate that when you looked at cognitive function with a sugary soft drink versus a diet soft drink, the sugary soft drink had a more negative effect than the diet soft drink. So, does that mean you should go pound a diet soda? No. But if you had to look at diet soda versus regular soda and the overall markers on metabolic health, not just microbiome, probably would lean towards the diet soda. But now we're in a situation where we have a lot of other options like Zevias. And again, I'm not sponsored by them, but Zevias are stevia sweetened sodas that you can get, naturally sweetened that's still 0 calorie. Okay, you want to be paying attention to these things because sugar has an effect on cognition. High fructose corn syrup has an effect on cognition. Okay, protein has an effect on cognition in a good way. Fats have an effect on cognition. And then another thing that you can simply start to do when it comes down to like neuroinflammation and overall things like that, reduce the alcohol consumption as well. I've talked about this in other videos, but alcohol can play a huge role in how our brain functions, specifically when it comes to the volume of gray matter and white matter. Okay, so a few quick things to change. Avocado oil to fry in. Okay, things like cassava or tapioca root flour to use when you're making any kind of breading. Okay, some kind of monk fruit or stevia sweetener instead, just to be able to start changing things. Reduction of alcohol overall, okay? And just being able to change overall how you combine fats and carbs together on the regular. So as always, keep it locked in here on my channel. I'll see you tomorrow.